Welcome to Center Stage. My name is Mark Gordon. Stephen Wooley is an award-winning producer of such films as The Crying Game and Interview with the Vampire. In 2005, we met to talk about his latest film, Stoned, which follows the life and mysterious death of Rolling Stones co-founder Brian Jones.
Center Stage, Center Stage, Center Stage. Center Stage.
I started this film when I was producing Interview with the Vampire, and because Brad Pitt is such a huge Rolling Stones fan, during the first period of the film, there were big rumours saying Brad Pitt was going to play Brian Jones, which patently was never going to happen because I didn't even discuss it with Brad. But from then through End of the Affair, through Butcher Boy, and all the other films I produced, I was kind of going back to it. So it was sort of like starting something and delving back in, and then doing another movie and then delving back in. I think during The Good Thief, which was the film I made with Nick Nolte in the south of France, was the point where I realised, God, I've really got to get this film on the road. I've been playing around with it for so long. And that was the point where the writers also said to me, you've got to direct this yourself. This is crazy. You can't invest so much into something and then just give it to someone else. It's not going to happen. I think they were just scared that it wouldn't get made, to be honest.
Well, as much as Brad Pitt, he's a great actor, but I think for this type of film, you really need someone that doesn't really have a following in terms of, when you see Brad Pitt, you already know all the stuff that he's done, and he's a big personality. So
the casting was exactly as you're saying. I had a problem, which is that, if I'd have cast Ewan McGregor or Jude Law, I think people would have thought, oh, that's Jude Law with a wig, or that's Ewan McGregor doing Brian, And I wanted somebody that would be readily accepted as being Brian Jones, rather than an actor that you would recognise, And that's happened to me in the past as a producer, where I've cast somebody in a film that, I think Julia Roberts I remember in Michael Collins was a problem for Americans, because they accepted the film. They accepted Liam Neeson and Stephen Ray and Alan Rickman and Aidan Quinn, but then when Julia came on, I could feel in the American audience kind of go, oh, it's a Hollywood biopic. So up to a certain point, they really bought the film, and they bought into the truth of it. But then as soon as you get somebody as famous as Julia Roberts playing an historical character, people lose it, and they just don't accept it, don't buy it. In Europe, it didn't happen that way. In Britain and Ireland, people just completely bought the film, didn't have a problem with it at all, and thought Julia was great. But they just don't have the same. Americans have a very different resonance with certain characters like Julia Roberts or Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise. They expect them to be in certain types of movies. And if you come out of that, for instance, if Tom Cruise were to do Julius Caesar tomorrow, as soon as you see Tom Cruise in a toga, you will go, oh my God, that isn't how I perceive Tom Cruise to be.
Right.
Tom Cruise is Mission Impossible. Tom Cruise is very, very current, very modern, very sort of chiseled American guy from now. And so some actors really have a problem, I think, trying to get outside of the box that they're in for themselves.
Well, it's kind of like you have personality, and for example, a Dustin Hoffman or Al Pacino, they used to, or even now this Philip Seymour Hoffman, he's done so many different roles that he's kind of a chameleon.
Yeah, Gene Hackman. There are actors that are actors, and people accept them as such, and then there are actors that become stars. And the problem with the star syndrome is that you expect your stars to be who they are. And I think that's what happened to Jack Nicholson. If you look at the golden age of Jack Nicholson, which was probably through the 60s to around about 75, 76, he could play anything. And he did everything. Five Easy Pieces and wonderful movies. Just Drive, he said, up until, I think, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then he became Jack Nicholson. Then he became a star. He became someone that you recognised as Jack Nicholson, and that almost parody of Jack Nicholson became the Jack Nicholson that we know now. But for a while, he was just like Philip Seymour Hoffman. He was an amazing actor that just did all sorts of things. And so for Stoned, I didn't want to have someone that was a kind of already established, mannered performance. I needed somebody that people would go, oh, that's Brian Jones. So Leo Gregory, who plays Brian Jones, he's done a few movies. One called Out of Control, which he was absolutely brilliant in, but he was a very different kind of character from the character he plays in my movie. So I cast him after I'd met him, because when I saw him in the film, I thought, oh my God, this guy is so rough and tough and evil. Brian was like an angel, and there was no angelic qualities within the film that I saw within Out of Control that Leo was in. But I met the guy and he was so sweet and lovely and nice, and I thought, oh, actually, he's acting. He's a good actor. So,
well, you really need that for this character, I think, too, because part of him is a little bit naive and almost helpless. I mean, there's a funny scene in the film where it's raining and he calls his assistant, the builder, to fix he thinks that the sewage or whatever is going to overflow.
Yeah, it's the cesspool.
And it turns out he just has to put a cover over it.
On. Yeah, Brian was like that. Brian was very reliant upon help from people. So was Keith Richards, actually. I mean, the Rolling Stones were successful very quickly and extremely popular, and they were very kind of small, skinny guys that just really weren't used to lifting things up or fixing things. They were very spoiled at a very early age, and people like Frank Thorogood, who's played by Paddy Considine in the movie, and Tom Keelock, who's played by David Morrissey, were the kind of people that really they needed around them. They actually needed people to put things, on. I mean, lift up heavy objects. They just didn't do that. And because they were so pressured with their fame, with the girls and the huge amount of interest, there really wasn't a sort of security firm or a kind of PR helper that was in those days that could really look after those kind of guys. They were reliant upon the police or the kind of social services in a sense. So someone like Frank Thorogood in The Life of Brian Jones was absolutely essential, and he was really a terrific aid to Brian. He wasn't just a builder; he was also his butler and his security guy and his cook and his gopher, and that's what fascinated me with the film was how did someone like Frank, who was just a builder from North London working class background, get to be in the life of someone like Brian Jones, this massively successful star who had been on some of the biggest hits of the 60s. And what would that world be like for both of them? What would the world be like for Brian, inviting into his home someone who had no concept of what Brian was talking about or recording or thinking about? That was the big mistake that Brian made.
I was reading in the production notes how it's almost a metaphor for the death of Brian Jones and the death of the innocence of the 60s. And then it's this, also, just getting back to Frank's character, is this juxtaposition of Frank almost is metaphoric for the working class, and then you have Brian for this opulent society.
Yeah, very much so. That again, it was a real pull for me with this story was that I was, I didn't think I was very poor, but when I grew up in London, we 5 of us slept in one room, and we had a small kitchen with a coal fire and a little black and white TV. We didn't have a fridge, or we didn't have a car or a telephone, but we didn't think we were poor. A lot of people in London live that way, and my uncles had all fought in the war, and my dad had also. And they were very sort of, by the early 60s, they were very angry because London was a bomb site. It took a long time for Britain to recover from the efforts of the Second World War. And they'd won the war through discipline and order. And then in the 60s, you saw these bands like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and the Animals, and they were long-haired, very sort of effeminate kind of kids who were making all this money and getting all these girls and getting all this fame. And here was this generation of men. They weren't old men. They were in their 30s and 40s. You know, they were pretty, you know, many of them went to war, were called up in the 40s. And, you know, they were angry by what was going on. You know, that the generation gap was never larger than it was in the 60s in Britain. These men were very, very angry with their sons and their daughters who dared to wear miniskirts and grew their hair long and followed these bands like the Rolling Stones. And so for me, the character of Frank represented not a strange character or in any way obscure person, but really represented most of the people living in Britain at that time, the responsible people that were part of the establishment, who had followed the rules and had followed order. I mean, you don't win a war by getting out of bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, you win a war by being disciplined and ordered. So Frank really, I had a lot of sympathy for that character because I knew him. And even though I knew as a child, growing up in the 60s, that world of Brian Jones and the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Animals was the world that I would inherit, even though we had no money and we lived in a very impoverished way. That was all going to change. We were going to have this wonderful idea of the 60s. And so the swinging 60s only really swang for around about 0.1% of the population. And the rest of us looked into this bubble. And the thing about the bubble is that, you know, my generation wanted to be in the bubble. We wanted the hedonism and the fun and to be part of that big party going on. But most people wanted to destroy the bubble. They hated it. It's like, you know, we can't have that. You know, so that was the real 60s in London, in Britain. And I think that when you look at Austin Powers, or you look at the kind of spoof notion of the swinging 60s in London, it actually wasn't like that. There weren't that many girls wearing miniskirts. There wasn't that much commotion going on. You know, if somebody walked down Carnaby Street with a different kind of costume or a weird outfit, the TV crews would be out immediately. You know, it was the media coverage in the 60s was huge, and that media coverage, of course, switched people on to the 60s. People like, you know, like kids like myself and my cousins or whatever. But the mods and rockers were very, very few and very far between, and they were being. But if there were a group of mods or rockers, they'd be filmed, and you guys in America would see it and think, oh my God, look at Britain, it's fantastic. There's hundreds and thousands of all these hippies wandering around and all these mods and these rockers, and it wasn't like that really. It was a very small percentage of the population. So I kind of wanted to show Brian as someone who was truly an icon of the 60s, and unlike Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, who died very quickly after Brian's death, at the same age of 27, which was very eerie and bizarre. But they've become icons of the 60s. And I think partly because the Rolling Stones have continued, Brian seems to have been forgotten. And yet here he was, truly an icon, truly a real mover and shaker of the 60s, who seems to have been written out of all the textbooks. You know, that was the fascination for me with Brian. Not that he was murdered, which of course the film is about his murder. That was pretty sensational when I read these books about his murder. Everybody assumed that Brian had just taken loads of drugs and got drunk and fell into a swimming pool. The murder was sensational, but what was more sensational for me was that he was such an important figure. He was the catalyst, the guy who started the Rolling Stones, the guy who introduced so many people to the Afro-American music of people like Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and Elmore James. You know, Brian was a massively important person in that time. He was the friend of Bob Dylan. He was the guy that John Lennon respected. You know, he reintroduced Jimi Hendrix to America at Monterey in 1967. And so why did I not know who he was? You know, I just remember there was a blonde guy in the Rolling Stones who kind of died alongside all these other people. And that's really what propelled me to want to make the film was the idea of that class difference, which was explored so succinctly in a film called The Servant by Joe Losey, with a wonderful script by Harold Pinter in the early 60s. And then again, you know, with performance, the whole notion of what these rock stars needed, what their sort of need for these stronger guys would lead to other things going on in their heads and their lives.
Well, you're talking about the Mick Jagger film performance?
Yeah.
You know, you really do get a sense in your film Stoned that, because I was also reading that the Mick Jagger character could have been Brian Jones.
Yeah.
And maybe this gangster that comes up could have represented Frank.
Yeah, a little bit like that. But both The Servant and Performance were, you know, films that I kind of thought about a lot whilst I was shooting and writing the script for this. I think more with Performance, the decadence of that character that Mick plays in the film, because Mick had originally turned the script of Performance down, and because he said, this isn't me, I'm not an actor, I can't play this part, it's really ridiculous. And Donald Cammell, who was a very, very good friend of Brian Jones and the Rolling Stones, who had written Performance, based it on Brian. So Marianne Faithfull had said to Mick, just play Brian, just do Brian. So if anybody gets to see Performance, which they certainly should, because it's the kind of seminal sort of 60s movie, really, for the dark side of the 60s, they'll see Mick Jagger doing an impersonation of Brian Jones, basically, with a black wig. So he played a dark side of Brian, and that film was, but it was also the idea of welcoming into your house death, which was, in Performance, was James Fox, and
it was
embracing
really
that.
Well, it was unsettling too. You didn't know if this gangster was gonna, you know, was gonna kill Mick Jagger or
love him. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very creepy.
Yeah, they kept the whole thing going in Performance, which was terrific. And that, and again, I've sort of reduced it down to its elements with Stoned. So there are kind of reflections of Performance, certainly through Brian Jones's relationship with Anita Pallenberg, which was very decadent and very strange and lots of fun, lots of S&M and lots of drug taking and lots of frolicking in the 60s. But that sort of begins to turn bad, and I think that there were the elements of Performance I wanted, but also that invitation of that you invite death into your home. There's a certain point, I think, where Brian maybe had, his talent may have run its course, and although strangely, you see, unlike Mick Jagger, who obviously has still perpetuates the same sort of performance that he gave in 1969, you know, now on the road with the Rolling Stones, with their huge sellout tour of North America, which seems to be endless and seems to be so popular, it's almost unbelievable. But Mick is still doing what Mick did. You know, it's not that he has extended his talents too much, it's just that his talent, our fascination for him and Keith has just gone on. It's almost like genetically passed down, that somehow we want to see Mick Jagger doing his stuff on stage. For Brian, it was far more intellectual, it was far more, as an artist, he wanted to stretch himself. He wanted to record those musicians in Tijuca, these incredible Moroccan musicians. He wanted to score the film that he scored with Volker Schlondorf, who later went on to make The Tin Drum, which won the Oscar. So, you know, Brian may have well scored an Oscar-winning movie. So in terms of world music, he was renowned through his peers like Pete Townsend and George Harrison and John Lennon. You know, that Brian was the guy you would speak to about, you know, how do you play a sitar? How do you work? You know, who is the best slide guitarist? You know, Brian knew everything about musicians and music. So in a sense, Brian was way, way, way ahead of his time, and much more of a Renaissance man than any of the other Rolling Stones. What Keith and Mick knew how to do was what they still do now, which was to rock and roll. They were rock and rollers. Brian wasn't a rock and roller. Brian was an intellect, and he was incredibly charming. He sadly wanted to experiment in everything and wanted to push the barriers sexually, politically, certainly in terms of experimenting with drugs, Brian was in the forefront of everything, which was kind of sad for him. Although, you know, as we say in the film, when he died, there really wasn't. There was one prescribed drug in his bloodstream, and which was amphetamine, which had been given to him by his private doctor, and some alcohol, which actually wasn't that excessive. So strangely, Brian was weaning himself off the destructive drugs that he was taking, and so it's interesting. I wonder, you know, it's a great sort of dinner party kind of conversation about what Brian Jones would have done if he had survived the 60s. And, you know, I think in the film, I kind of suggest that Brian really would never have survived if it wasn't at the hands of the guy who lived in his house, who was the builder, Frank Thorogood. It could have been almost anyone. Brian was so prone to winding people up, to pushing them, constantly pushing all the women around him. I mean, the 5 children he had that he didn't really didn't take any responsibility for, from 5 different women. You know, he was so unable to grow up. He was such a child, and so irresponsible and so immature when it came to anything other than music or that world of music, fashion, fame. He was very grown up in that sense, that he certainly knew how to dress, he knew how to behave. He could articulate the music of the Rolling Stones, and that was the thing that Mick couldn't do until the Stones were really up and running by about 65, 66. Finally, Mick and Keith got a voice, but in those early days, Brian was, you know, it was his band. They toured Germany, and they were called Brian Jones and the Rolling Stones, you know. And that's, again, coming back to the motivation of making this film. It was a strong motivation for me to say, look, okay, I know that Brian was only in the band for 7 years, and they've been touring for 44 years, a long time. And I know that he really, you know, that they made some of the more successful albums after Brian's death. But he doesn't seem acknowledged at all. Mick never talks about him. Keith never talks about him. The Rolling Stones seem to have forgotten who Brian Jones was. The fact that Bill Wyman is the only Rolling Stone who says, no Jones, no Stones. You know, it was Brian's band. He put them together to play the blues, to play music that people in Britain hadn't heard. Well, white people in America hadn't heard it either, to be frank. But Brian had this obsession with Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Elmore James, and you know, it was him who was like unemployed making this band work, while Mick Jagger was at London School of Economics and Keith Richards was at art school. They didn't know about the Rolling Stones. They were like, well, let's play it. You know, we don't want to lose our education. But Brian was the one who was like forcing the band. You know, and the very, very beginning of the film, you see Brian on the phone saying, yeah, I'm Brian Jones, the manager of the Rolling Stones. He was their manager. He was their everything, you know, their inspiration. So for his memory, or for the memory of Brian to have been eradicated, is kind of weird. It's kind of odd.
And we're talking tonight with Stephen Wooley, and he is the director of Stoned. I really like the way that the whole film is shot, because you really do bring back the whole
Thank you.
Of the 60s, and you know, I think of some of the classic films of that time. Just the way it was like somehow they discovered to use the zoom, and so everything would like zoom in, and also looking at the opulence, the costumes. Even in the beginning of the film, we see the footage of the band playing. The way you shot it, it really harkens back to looking at possibly some old newsreel footage of early days of the Stones or the Beatles. So tell me about that process.
Well, I had a very good cameraman, Johnny Matheson, who did Gladiator and was Oscar nominated and has done some of the biggest movies in the world. I mean, and John and I went through the script, and we basically, every flashback is a different film stock or a different way of shooting. So we used 16mm, we used 8mm, we used reversal stock. Some of it is color saturated. we tried to create a feeling of a movie that could have been shot in the 60s. So when we opened the film with the Rolling Stones at the Marquee Club in 1963, it's monochrome, it's black and white, it looks like photographs. We keep freezing frames so you can see the Stones as they were when Brian was really the leader of the band. In terms of the look of the film, we actually found clothes that Brian wore. We found clothes that Anita Pallenberg wore. My costume designer Roger has the largest collection of 60s clothes in Europe, and he, through the use of the internet, was able to get hold of bits of necklaces and shoes that they actually wore. So we really did research the look pretty thoroughly. And in terms of the shooting of the film, I used a lot of low angles. I tried to make the film look a little bit like those films that inspired me, like The Servant and Performance, and certainly films like The Ipcress File, which, where you're not quite with the action all the time. You're sort of slightly separated. So the film has, I hope, a very 60s feel for those people who remember or have seen 60s movies. Those people that haven't, will be hopefully pleasantly surprised by the style of the movie, because it's very un-MTV. Although there are montages and there are musical sequences, they're much more like a 60s musical sequence or a 60s montage where you actually see things. If we were filming now, for instance, you are wearing this wonderful suit and tie, and we would see that tie, in Stoned. You would actually linger on the tie so we see it. Whereas most modern films, which just don't linger on anything, they're just so fast. They're just like someone walks in a room, sits down, bang, out, good, done, fast. I'd gone to so much trouble making people look the way they looked, whether it was the way that Keith Richards looked, or the way that Anita Pallenberg looked, or simply the girls in the office when Frank Thorogood tries to get his money. The makeup, the hair, the accoutrements of the 60s were, beautifully art directed within the film, and I wanted to see them. As a producer, I always hated making films and building wonderful sets and having a terrific art department and not seeing it. Somebody walks into a shop, they buy a newspaper, they walk out, but we have all this beautiful stuff here and we're not seeing it. And I think in the 60s people wanted you to see those things, and I certainly wanted the effect of this film to be a trip back, and to a lot of young people, another universe, like going on a trip to Mars. This is a trip back to the 60s, and for an older audience, a nostalgic visit back to a place they remembered. So I was very, very keen and very careful about really trying to create this other world. It's not Star Wars, but for me it is another universe, another galaxy, another dimension. And as a producer, through making films like Scandal and Backbeat, Backbeat was about the Beatles and Hamburg, and Scandal was about the infamous Christine Keeler, Mandy Rice Davis sex scandal that brought down the Tory government of the early 60s. Both of those films I worked with first-time directors, and as a producer had a very strong hand in creating that particular time, which was the early 60s. In this film, I'm creating another part of the 60s, which is the late 60s. And so I was very meticulous about the haircuts, and you see the Rolling Stones at the beginning of the film with fairly short hair and looking pretty conservative with their suits and things. And as the film progresses and you see flashback after flashback, you see the hair getting longer and longer, and you see the clothes getting more extravagant, and you see Brian Jones more flamboyant. Because Brian was kind of like a sort of heterosexual version of Oscar Wilde, or actually probably a bisexual version of Oscar Wilde, a very strange kind of sort of a precursor to David Bowie and Mark Bolan, to the glam rock days that followed quite quickly afterwards in the early 70s. Brian would have been so loved by those glam rockers because he was glam rock before glam rock was invented. Brian was wearing women, you know, makeup and dressing in the most outrageous way.
Well, you know, there's an interesting part in the film when Frank, he spends the night, and then the door opens and you think a woman's coming in the room.
Yeah.
And it actually is a woman, right? And,
Yeah.
And then, but I like the way you did that because it was like, he really kind of blurred gender, you know, didn't he?
That was the first night that we see that Frank Thorogood stays at the house, and he gets drunk with Brian, and we immediately set up this notion of Frank's kind of more romantic idea of Brian by seeing a woman walk towards Frank, and then it becomes Brian. But Brian always wore his girlfriend's clothes. I mean, he was wearing his a woman's dressing gown, and that was the thing with Brian. He's always wearing Anna's sunglasses and acting in a kind of very effeminate way, which is part of his success with women. I mean, Marianne Faithfull again talks about how Brian would come round when Mick wasn't around and get into bed with her, and it would be like a sister coming around, be like a girlfriend. You know, sometimes they'd have sex, sometimes they wouldn't have sex, but it was Brian needing, you know, that kind of female company. And women were very relaxed around Brian. They felt that he was very sort of like simpatico with them. You know, he would talk about clothes and makeup and hair, and boys didn't do that. Men didn't talk about those kind of things in the 60s. The men were men, you know, and Brian was not of that sort of absolute gender. He was of a mixed gender. And yeah, I established that pretty fast in the film, and certainly it is that teasing of Frank's sexuality that finally, you know, leads to it is the final straw, I think, when Brian starts to say, you know, you want to take over from Anna, you want to be my lover, essentially, and you can never be that. And that kind of notion has never consciously entered Frank's mind, but subconsciously it's there from the moment he arrives at the house.
And we're talking with Stephen Wooley, and the name of the film is Stoned. A lot of research going into this, obviously 10 years. And there were several books that were written about Brian Jones. And
yeah.
So how did you go about getting the interviews with people to really make sure that you were creating something that was authentic?
Well, you know, the books were terrific. I read first Paint It Black, The Murder of Brian Jones, and then Who Killed Christopher Robin, The Murder of Brian Jones. The problem for me was that the good thing about the books is that they spoke very much about how important Brian was and who the man was. And so when I acquired the rights on those books, I was acquiring the rights on something which talked about his murder, but more importantly, books that talked about Brian and the importance of Brian in the 60s. But the murders thing was a bit worrying for me. I never felt that the two writers of those books had really done their homework. And so I found Anna Wolin. There were only 4 people there the night that Brian died. Brian, of course, Frank Thorogood, Anna Wolin, who was the girlfriend of Brian Jones, his last girlfriend, and Janet Lawson, who was a nurse who happened to be there. And none of the books really kind of quite explained why she was there. But anyhow, I tracked Anna Wolin down by using a private detective in Stockholm, and I flew her to London and interviewed her extensively, and she then published her book, which was called The Murder of Brian Jones. And so I had the rights on that book as well, and I also bought Tom Keelocker as a road manager and as a consultant. And then in the sort of mid-90s, the police thought that they might reopen the case, so they asked people to come forward with any information about what happened that day. And they didn't really have enough information, so they passed it all on to me, which was quite good of them. The phone numbers of the people that had come forward. And they said that Janet Lawson was probably dead, this nurse who was there at the poolside, and that she'd disappeared in 1969. They couldn't trace her or find her. And so I then hired another private detective on the recommendation of Stanley Kubrick's assistant, and he managed to find an address for me for Janet Lawson. So I wrote to Janet quite a long, detailed letter explaining that, you know, I'd produced films like The Crying Game and Michael Collins and Backbeat and Scandal, and, you know, I wanted to make a film that was not some kind of, you know, just some sort of trashy movie about Brian and his death, and that she held the key for me as to how he died, what actually happened that night. So luckily her daughter was at art college and she'd seen a lot of the films that I produced and encouraged her mum to come forward. So Janet broke her vow of silence, and she hadn't spoken to any of the press or the police or any of the authors of the books at that time, and subsequently has gone back into obscurity. But she told me, she gave me this huge interview. I took her back to the house. We went back to the pool where Brian died, where she discovered the body, and then I reunited her with Tom Keelock, her ex-lover, and we videotaped everything. And she told me wonderful facts about the last day, that it wasn't a big party. The books talked about lots of people being there and cars coming and going, and you know, if you'd read the books you'd think it was like Piccadilly Circus, that there was just a massive sort of orgiastic party, but it wasn't. It was very quiet. Both girls said the same thing. This was incredible because Anna and Janet didn't speak to each other at times, certainly haven't spoken to each other since, had nothing in common. Anna hated Janet because Janet was another woman, and Anna was obsessively in love with Brian Jones. Janet had no thought for Anna because she was there to meet her friend Tom Keelock, and she didn't like the Rolling Stones very much anyway. So there was a kind of there was animosity from the first moment they met. They didn't speak to each other, and certainly haven't spoken to each other since. And yet both of their descriptions of the night were very clear. One from the point of view of Brian Jones, which was Anna's point of view. She told me that Brian had fired Frank Thorogood that morning, which she hadn't told the police at all, which gave a lot of motivation for Frank, and then for Frank to be angry with Brian. And what Janet told me was that Frank had tried to molest her, that Frank had put some sort of weird tasting substance into their food, that Frank had got her drunk on vodka, that Frank was shaking so violently when he came to the house looking for a towel that he couldn't light his cigarette. All these things were completely new. They weren't in the books. They certainly weren't in the police statements at the time, and allowed me the freedom to actually make the film. The books worried me. They didn't seem as if they had actually researched the material enough. But when I had tracked down Anna Wooley in Stockholm and then tracked down Janet Lawson, I felt free, that I felt sort of unburdened to make the film the way that the film is, which was that it was a very quiet and quite disturbing night when Brian died. It wasn't a sort of crazy party or mad sort of big mistake. It was actually much more scary than that. It's quite a kind of gothic moment. And I was very lucky with the house that we found, which isn't actually Brian's house, because Brian's house wasn't as wonderful as the house we had. But I wanted the house to play a part in the film, and it overlooks this sort of tragedy of his death. I'm making the film sound very serious and very depressing, but it's actually, there is some
But you know, that's
fun
one
in
thing
it.
I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised with, because normally when you see a biopic about you know, a rock star that you know is careening out of control and it's going to have a bad ending, it can be a little bit depressing.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I didn't really get the vibe, and I think it's maybe the little button you put at the end of the film. But
no, I bring the ghost of Brian back in. I needed Brian to say those words, that the problem with happiness is that it is boring, because I think that is the problem with happiness, is that we all have this notion of what happiness is, and certainly most people wouldn't think that happiness is coming in on a Sunday morning and conducting an interview, but that, you know, you're working, you're doing the thing you enjoy, and in fact that is the notion of happiness, is that it occurs in retrospect. You're never consciously happy, and if you are consciously happy, it is boring. I mean, lying on the beach with a book after 10 minutes becomes boring. You know, it's not. It's the idea that you're relaxing, and you can relax in many ways, or the idea that you're participating in something that you love to do. That's a form of happiness, and I think I wanted the Ghost of Brian to kind of rebalance the film at the end, and that's why I brought him in. And I also wanted to see, you know, the show that life with Anita Pallenberg and the life that Brian led, you know, was actually a lot of fun. they were having a good time. It's not a moral story of drugs are bad for you. It's in a sense, the film is really about excess. Excess is probably bad for you, and Brian was an excessive hedonistic character. But there was a lot of fun to be had in that, and I think anybody seeing the movie will want to get the next plane to Marrakesh immediately, because I think Morocco and that world they lived in Marrakesh was incredibly sexy and incredibly fun and incredibly kind of compulsive. I feel it's a trip back to the '60s that is both incredibly hopefully seductive, but also also quite dark. I have to finish there because I have to go to my next meeting. So if you have one question.
No, just thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. It's great you came in. I'm
There's
really
so
impressed.
many questions.
No,
but,
I can keep talking forever, but
it was great. I mean,
it's now 12:05, and I think I've just blown my next meeting. Is it really 12:05?
Well, we'll wrap it up, and thank you so much. You're just a wealth of knowledge too on film.
No, I'm really really pleased I did this, and this is a great little place. All of these records here.
Yeah, a lot of bands come here, new bands, and it's amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible.
You know who started here was Beck.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he came. No one would play him, and then he
That's
he
interesting.
got his break here.
God, I love Beck.
Yeah. Well, listen.
You didn't like me either. That was interesting.
Yeah. Well, listen. Thank you so much, Stephen Wooley, and best of
Thank
luck
you
with
very
Stoned.
much. Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you. That's
Bye.
great.
If you would like more information about Stephen Wooley, visit imdb.com. Until next time, this is Mark Gordon, and I'll see you center stage.
Center stage, center stage, center, center, center stage. Center stage.
Hello, this is Homer Simpson. Whenever I want to know what's going on in the entertainment world, I listen to Center Stage with Mark Gordon.